Hello, friends. Welcome to the SIPS series. These foundational strategies were nominated by listeners. They told me these are the ideas in the podcast that truly made a difference for them. So I distilled them down into short, actionable insights. There's not going to be any fluff or complex jargon, just practical, real-world diabetes management that you can start applying today. And I know your time is valuable, so we're keeping these short. Another small sip will come out once a week for the foreseeable future. If you like what you hear, check out the Pro Tip series or the Bold Beginnings series for more. Those series are available in the menu at juiceboxpodcast.com, and you can find complete lists of all of the series in the featured tab on the private Facebook group. Please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. The questions you have, I guarantee you, there's answers to them in the Juicebox Podcast, and it's all free.
I like blanket of insulin.
You want to go blanket of insulin?
Yeah, I
all
like
right.
that one. I think that's a good one.
Do you remember what I said?
I don't remember what you said, honestly, but just looking at the title of it, I'm assuming that it has something to do with almost like an extended bolus or a temp basal use, or expecting that the food that you're eating, which we kind of alluded to already in a lot of these that we've just done, is that it's not just carb that you're eating most often, and that you might need a stretch out of insulin.
And that ends up being the answer to the question. But but the reason I once said, I remember saying it to you, by the way, because I used a weird phrase and you laughed. So I remember saying to you, in a carby situation, and then you laughed at carby.
Oh.
In an overly carby situation, I try to think of it like this. So first things first, your basal is set where your basal is set, right? Mm-hmm. And if you most days eat a certain way, and then all of a sudden on Saturday are like, I'm going out for pizza. I'm not even going to get good pizza. I'm going to go to Pizza Hut. No disrespect to those of you who like Pizza Hut. And like, so I'm going to get, frozen crust, because, they
meat
don't.
lovers that's then processed.
Probably cheese, like if I'm going to go eat all of that, what happens is people say, well, I expect my blood sugar to go up. What I say is I expect your need to rise. So I used to tell people, this is before automated systems, in situations like that for my daughter, I would lay what I thought of as a heavy blanket of insulin over the timeline of the impact of the food. Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, I would use a temp basal increase.
Right.
Right.
Yep. Most effective for high fat. Again, conventional pumps eons ago, before any of the AID systems and the compensations and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was either temp basal, usually was for really high fat,
right,
or the potential of even knowing that, again, with experience, your pizza example being, well, gosh, I bolus the whole thing, I go low, and then it sits high for hours and hours and hours later. So it might even be two smart feature uses, like an extended bolus as well as a temp basal for hours later. Yeah.
My thought here is just that, it's obvious, like you're going to hear your doctor talk about, do they call them square waves anymore? Or is that saying gone? Is it just?
It's interesting because the square wave and dual wave, I think they were coined by Medtronic, if I'm correct, like eons ago, because their pump offered the ability to choose between the two. One, the dual wave being dual, two-part, 1% of insulin now of the total bolus, the other percent delivered over a time period.
Yeah.
And then the square wave was the whole amount delivered over a time frame that you designate.
Oh, okay.
So, yes.
Yeah. And so like Omnipod DASH still does extended, like some now, the rest over a time frame. So like for those of you who don't use this feature, if you as an example, pizza's a good example, right? Like it might not hit you right away, but you need something at the beginning, but it's going to hit you harder like 45 minutes in. So you might do, you might say, okay, I think this is, 50 carbs, and your pump might say that's 5 units. You might say, okay, well then I'd like 2 units to go in now and the other 3 units to go in over the next 40 minutes or whatever.
Right.
Extended bolus. I would do that. And on top of that, do a temp basal increase, like sometimes. So like what I ended up doing, Jenny, is I would look back over a failed experiment and say, I used her carb ratio and it said she needed 5 units. But by the time this fight was over, we ended up using more like 7.5.
Yeah.
So I'm like, let me get those other 2.5 units in there somehow. I used to think, put it in as basal because you could always take the basal away, right? And it wouldn't be as impactful as just jamming in the 2.5 units. Like maybe I'll just just say your basal's, I don't know, a unit an hour. I might just make it 100% increase for 2 hours to get in 2 extra units of basal. You could always bail on it later, and it shouldn't have as big of an impact as just throwing it in the whole 2 units at once and realizing you didn't need it. But
right.
I think that overall, the takeaway I would like people to have is that, food or, stress, anything that's trying to push your blood sugar up is being met, in my mind, by a force above it trying to push it back down again.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an amount of basal I usually use. There's an amount of bolus I usually use. And when we get into carbier situations, those settings I have might not work. I need more resistance on the top half pushing down on that number. And I would try to find ways to spread it out that was most effective while still being something I could get away from without causing a low. So I know it's weird, but in my mind's eye, there's a blanket of insulin over the timeline of the impact of the carbs. That's how it seems to me.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it. I always describe fat to people like the fat is sitting on your insulin, kind of like you'd sit on a beanbag chair, right? It's nice and puffed up in a circle. You sit on it. What do you get? Like a 50% reduction in its normal puffed up feature, right? So you sit on it, you are the fat. You are decreasing your basal now in its effectiveness from 1 unit an hour to 0.5 units an hour because fat creates a resistant environment.
Yep.
Now, like you said, I love that example because you're using a temp basal, you can easily cancel it. And now when you stand up from sitting on the beanbag, if you've got a good beanbag chair, it starts to puff back up pretty quickly, right? And so then you can take that away without effectively having a long, lingering impact.
Yeah. I remember when Arden moved to an automated system, the first one she ever used was Loop. And I had an app where I could watch it giving and taking away basal. And I remember having this moment where I was like, oh, it's doing what I've been doing.
Yeah.
And I thought, maybe I could stop doing it now.
Maybe I can sleep finally.
Actually, that's what happened is I got to sleep because the things I'm talking about, they don't end because you go to sleep or, because it's Christmas Day or anything like that. And while I did get a ton of experience and knowledge from doing it, which I guess is helping now with the podcast, I was tired.
Yeah.
And now I take what I know and I can apply it to the automated system if I need to, though Arden's older and, not as involved with me as she has been. I can apply what I know there. And I do sometimes. I sent her a text the other day that says, Arden's using Trio now. I sent her a text that said, set a temp basal. Like just for a half an hour. Like it's taking basal away right now, but we don't want that. And I know we don't want that because you were just home for a break eating good, wholesome foods. And now you're back at school eating whatever the hell you just ate. And those settings that we had working real nice for your 1 week break, they're not working anymore. And yes, Trio will get a little more aggressive in the next couple of days, but for today, it isn't, and it needs help. So it's cut your basal away, but you need the basal, so put it back. And then I usually get a text back that says something like, stop.
And at least even though she's responding that way, she's probably applying what you're telling her to do, despite being like, why are you telling me these things? Like, I'm done. Please stop, right?
She does. We're at this interesting moment now where she doesn't want to tell me she's done it. It just happens without her saying it. But stop is our diabetes love language.
Yes.
So, hey, is this a real low? Stop. I'm like, well, at least she knows she's low.
Right. Yes. Yeah, Trio and the other algorithms are really, they add another level of this blanket of insulin that requires attention when you first start using them because conventional pumping to AID pumping is a jump.
Yeah.
You have to relearn, not necessarily how insulin works, but how the system is working with insulin as it works for you.
Right. In one of these episodes, I'll do the tug of war thing, which I think makes the point about how I think about the blank of insulin slightly differently, but in a way that might help somebody.
Awesome.
Anyway, I appreciate this very much. Thank you.
Of course.
If you're looking for community around type 1 diabetes, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast, type 1 diabetes. But everybody is welcome. Type 1, type 2, gestational, loved ones, it doesn't matter to me. If you're impacted by diabetes and you're looking for support, comfort, or community, check out Juicebox Podcast, type 1 diabetes on Facebook. Are you starting to see patterns, but you can't quite make sense of them? You're like, oh, if I bolus here, this happens, but I don't know what to do. Should I put in a little less, a little more? If you're starting to have those thoughts, if you're starting to think, this isn't going the way the doctor said it would, I think I see something here, but I can't be sure. Once you're having those thoughts, you're ready for the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. It begins at episode 1000. You can also find it at juiceboxpodcast.com up in the menu, and you can find a list in the private Facebook group. Just check right under the featured tab at the top. It'll show you lists of a ton of stuff, including the Pro Tip series, which runs from episode 1000 to 1025. If you're not already subscribed or following in your favorite audio app, please take the time now to do that. It really helps the show. And get those automatic downloads set up so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast.